Amen. All right. Well, I got to admit, I'm a little nervous. It's been a while since I've been up here. And you would have had me a week or so ago, but Josh filled in for me. I want to publicly thank him, even though I know he's not here, for doing that, as we had to look after our little girl. But I'm excited to be here. One of the things that we are trying to accomplish in this class is going back and looking at the stories that most of us have probably known our whole lives, but going back and rereading them and understanding that we catch the things that we're meant to catch, that we see as we're older, we're more mature Christians. We see the things that are there for us to see. And to make application, when we want to see that these things that point to Christ, that point to the basis of doctrine as we understand it today, and look at what this means for us. And I'll be honest, when I first sat with Josh and Daniel to go over this material, and I said, Genesis, it's just old stuff. What does this have to do with where we are today? Obviously there's some obvious ones, right? But I was not prepared for how much there really is to think about what God was doing and paving the way for His people to understand and us to understand about Him and His plan for us. So that's what we're going to try to focus on. I know we've seen a lot in the first couple chapters, and frankly, it's been exciting for me. I hope you feel the same. So we'll get started in chapter 6. Hopefully you had a chance to read through. Chapter 6. We've had the records of the generations leading up to, from Adam and Eve to the present as we begin here chapter 6, and it's clear that things have kind of taken a turn for the worse. The chapter header, if you have them in your Bible, it says the corruption of mankind. So we've gone from this pretty great place a couple chapters ago, Eden, to mankind being corrupt. And so what was going on there? I guess that's a philosophical question. I'll answer it. What was going on there was that man had become wicked. You see in verse 5, the Lord saw that wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. We see also in verse 11, now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. So you've got this wickedness, evil intent, thoughts of man's heart continually. The violence abounds upon the earth, and so it begs the question: how did the people get this way? What is the cause of this corruption? Besides just being mankind and not doing things right. Absolutely. Yeah, this spiral of being focused on earthly and carnal things versus spiritual things absolutely has occurred. There's something that is specifically kind of says what maybe caused this to be here in chapter 6. The righteous begin to intermarry with the wicked. Was somebody else was going to say something?
I was going to say, verse 3 makes it sound like they're just living too long.
They're what? Too long?
Yeah, that's what it looks like in verse 3. It says, we got to shorten their days.
You get bored after the first 500-600 years, and your mind goes to bad, idle things. Maybe so. But yeah, Steve's kind of hit the nail on the head here. They were intermarrying with people that did not share their religious beliefs. Yeah, thank you. So, good thing you're here. I appreciate you. Right? And we can see this in verse 1 and 2. And now when it came about, when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose, and in verse 4, and they bore children to them. So they were marrying outside of their spiritual heritage or their spiritual lineage. And if we go back, which I know Daniel covered quite a bit on Sunday, but if we go back and look at these two distinct lineages that have been outlined, we'll see you'll see the stark contrast, right? So we start with the descendants of Cain. The first one that Daniel discussed was Cain's line in chapter 4. Cain himself obviously had sinned. He had lied to God and was punished. He tells us he himself went out from the presence of God. You look at these lineages, actually there's an Enoch and a Lamech in both, and the comparison is pretty notable. Enoch, Cain's son, had the city that Cain built named after him. You can imagine that probably brought some ego to being the city named after you. Lamech, who was 5 generations removed from Cain, if I can remember to catch up, was notable for all the wrong reasons. Daniel talked about this, so I don't want to spend too much time here. He's noted for taking 2 wives against God's design. He revels in and boasts about his sin to his wives. Listen to my voice, give heed to my speech. And he's seen as one who provokes sin and violence against others. We know for sure there was another man and a young boy who he had murdered for striking him. So you've got this bragging and boasting about sin, and he becomes the last of Cain's line to be mentioned in the Bible. So overall, with this line, you see this pride in self, this I'm going to do it alone, I don't need God, I'm away, I'm separated from God. And then there's no word of any faith or following God from this lineage. Is there any other ways that you would describe this lineage from what you've read or studied? Pretty simple, right? So now let's look at Seth's line. Seth's obviously born to Adam and Eve. Seth had a son named Enosh. Not much is said about him, but at the end of chapter 4, after his birth, it stated, "Then men began to call upon the name of the Lord." So this is the line that we saw from the beginning, right? That this is what should have been taking place all along. It becomes clear this would be the one to fulfill the promise made in chapter 3, verse 15, that the seed of woman would bruise the head of the serpent as well. 5 generations from Seth is Enoch. Enoch, as mentioned, twice walked with God. Again, a very notable compliment or comment, if you will. And Enoch is the first, Elijah being the second, that was taken by God. Did not experience an earthly death. And when you compare this fifth generation from Seth to the 5th generation from Cain of Lamech, it couldn't be any more different in terms of these lines. Lamech was 2 generations down from Enoch as Noah's father. And in naming him Noah, he really yearns for relief and comfort from the work and toil of the land and has hope that the Lord would relieve them through Noah. So I obviously don't know that he had envisioned that there would be a flood or something else, but Lamech, a lot of hope and yearning towards God for relief from the toil that they had been in. So you've got this line of Seth in comparison to the line of Cain that was very oriented towards God, yearning towards God, following God, very strong lineage here. And so when you think about this problem of marrying between the two, you can see that there would be a potential real issue here. So, but I just want to ask, had God told them not to marry outside their lineage? It's a really good question or a really bad question, right? Yes, Steve. No, I don't think we do have a record of that. It's not explicitly stated that they should not marry outside of their kind of spiritual heritage or spiritual lineage. So, but we do have other examples in the Old Testament that there are specific commands about that. Does anybody think of any of those off the top of their head? Where God made a specific command about marriage? It's okay, I have 2. Don't need pressure on yourselves. It's fine. Genesis 28:1 is one where Isaac, after stealing Esau's blessing, Isaac called Jacob in and told him not to take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. And also you have Deuteronomy 7:3 where Moses to the Israelites talking about entering the promised land says, "You shall not intermarry with them, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their daughters for your sons." Why? At verse 4 he says, "For they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods." Right? So clear evidence that this had happened in the history of God's people, and God gave specific instructions not to. But in this case, we don't know that God said not to do that, right? But this was a natural outcome. So those examples show clear instruction. The reasoning should have been clear to the recipient. But as we think about this, right, again, part of the point of the class is making impacts to us and how we think. What do you think are the lessons for us here? should marry a godly person. If you're a godly person, right? Yep. Evil companions corrupt good morals. Yeah. There's lots of kind of thoughts or sayings on that, and that sort of kind of one bad apple spoils a bunch, other stuff like that, right? Yeah, I think this is a look forward on the importance of who we choose to marry. Again, I don't think that, we don't have specific instructions on who to marry or not to marry as God's people today, but the weight of such a decision I don't think can be understated. It also, I don't think it says you shouldn't marry someone outside of the faith, or you can't do that. But I think there's an understanding here that, if you don't have shared values or alignment on how you make decisions together or what you weigh in those decisions, it likely makes for a harder path. And I think, we probably all have some examples of people that had a faithful spouse and a non-faithful spouse that was able to sway them and to change their heart. And so if you may be in that situation, certainly would encourage you to continue at it, being that good example, but probably been a harder path than maybe you would have imagined. So there's a clear case to make sure that, and in this case, they were marrying for physical attraction versus kind of a spiritual heritage. And there was supposed to be a joke in here somewhere about my wife choosing me not based on physical attraction, making a good decision, but there's a joke there somewhere. I'll let you figure out what it is. But I also think there's another thing, but beyond just marriage, right? What is something else you could think about God's instructions here and or not lack of instruction here and the consequences of that? Right. Sure. Yep, absolutely. Taking time to understand who this person is, right, beyond what you may see or what you may initially assess. And so along that lines, I think to me, the other thing that comes to mind is that this may be pointing to where we are today, that there are things that are, do we have a desire, an inner desire to be godly? Are they matters of the heart, or are we, just simply following rules or instructions? And in the absence of instructions, I think God had hoped, I would assume God had hoped, that they would want to seek after Him. And they would want to do that. And I think this potentially points us to where we are today, that how we choose to behave, how we choose to align ourselves is our own decision and our own desires versus we're potentially looking at a checklist or checking the box type of activities that some may say that the Bible may be full of. Thoughts on that or agreement or disagreement? Yep.
I think you have a great point comparing the two lineages in this instance where they both come from the same place, but you see the impact of heritage and apparently what they instill in their lineage as they pass down from generation to generation. We talked a lot about that last quarter in Judges, the impact that parents can have on children. But are we instilling this not just with your spouse, but also within your families, and then that being passed down, the desire to be godly, and then are you passing that information?
Yep. Yeah, spiritual heritage and your role in that as a parent or a grandparent and as a recipient can't be understated here, right? Any other comments or thoughts about that?
Kevin, I think, too, that we see the righteous line is set is losing their morals with everything, and we're seeing wickedness overpowering righteousness.
Right.
At this point, as we continue down and see what happens.
Absolutely. Yep. Even to Brian's point earlier, right? This good or evil companionship corrupts good morals, right? So the people had become corrupt. Evil was in their hearts. How does God handle this? Yeah, he promises to destroy them, right? He starts off with, in verse 3, I will number his days to be 120 years. Verse 7, he very clearly, I will blot out man from the face of the land. And in verse 13, he tells Noah that he would destroy man with the earth. So when you think about how God would handle this, so far throughout Genesis, what have we learned about God and how God deals with sin?
Very sad in that because he said he was sorry he even made it.
Yeah, certainly there is sadness and disappointment. Absolutely. Yeah. Sorry? There is. Yeah. And God, I think, has shown grace and mercy in trying to deal with those so far that had sinned.
That's what I'm saying. He typically doesn't come out right away and punish. There are situations where he did, but he's typically long suffering with man because he wants him to do what's right.
Right. Yep. What else would you take away from how God deals with sin? I would say God's decisive, right? And there's been no half measure in how God approaches these things. I think when you look back at the examples, the serpent, right, would, what was the serpent's punishment? Yep.
Yeah, he would crawl, like, slither on the ground, and then in the end, he crushed, his head be crushed.
Right, right. What about woman's, or became Eve? Pain in childbirth, right? Adam. Yeah, thorns and thistles. The ground will be cursed because of him. Adam and Eve together, expelled from the garden, right? Cain was cursed from the ground, would become a vagrant and a wanderer. So there's no, while I think there has been grace and mercy and patience, that comes to a point, and there's no kind of halfway dealing with it, right? It's here's how this is going to be. But amongst all this sin and corruption, we find Noah. How does sorry, I'm catching up on my slides here. How does the Bible describe Noah? Righteous and blameless. He found favor in the eyes of the Lord in verse 8. Blameless in his time. He also walked with God. Right, that thing from Enoch where he noted he walked with God. Noah also walked with God. In the New Testament, Hebrews 11:7 says that Noah was reverent. 2 Peter 2:5 calls Noah a preacher of righteousness. So in the middle of all this corruption, Noah stood out. His character was clear, as was his passion for God and God's ways. And God reveals to Noah his plan in verse 13. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. And behold, I am about to destroy them with the earth. And he shared his plan for Noah, verse 14. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. You shall make the ark with rooms and shall cover it inside and out with pitch. God would specify the measurements, the design, and the materials to be used in verses 15 and 16. And we'll take a look at the ark here in a minute. But before we do, I think if we take a step back and think about God's plan here, sin had got to this point where it had overtaken society, right? It had overtaken what people knew. And we see that God plans for a death and destruction to sin and the sinful lives that were going on, and makes provisions for a new and better life, or a rebirth for those who are faithful. Does that sound familiar to anybody? What does that sound like?
The anti-type, which now saves.
Yeah. Yeah, a death to sin and a rebirth, right? It sounds exactly like baptism. And again, you know, if we're looking at Genesis here as to what points forward to today and the coming of Christ and how we should live and the people that receive the word should live, it's really something to know that even in this destruction of the earth, that there would be a death and kind of a new life that would become so key and essential to part of that plan. Yeah, I thought I may have seen a hand. Any other thoughts or comments?
Chapter 5,
Sure.
29, Lamech said about his son Noah that this one will comfort us and give us relief.
Yeah. And I don't think he could have ever imagined that it would be in this way, right? DK, we had a conversation about this on the phone Sunday or so. Do you think that there were still good people on the earth when the flood came? What do you think? Obviously, we don't know. What do you think?
I think everybody was on the ark, and they were, Noah was preaching, I think, at the time he was building. So, I mean, they would have been on the ark, I would think. So I don't think there were any good people on earth when the flood happened.
Okay. Anybody agree or disagree?
If they did, they died soon.
Yeah. Good point. I think it's possible that there were. I don't know that it was the same type of situation where, what was it, Lot? If you could find 10 people, I'll spare the city. I don't know that that's the case. If you look at some of the genealogy that we went through in chapter 5, it talks about father and grandfather of Noah, and if you add up the years that they were alive, at least, I can't remember which one, at least one of them would have potentially died the year that the flood occurred. Is it Methuselah? Yeah. I didn't remember if it was Methuselah or another one. So it's possible that there were still good people on the earth, and that God's mission wasn't necessarily to save every good person or to carry them forward in this new start. But we don't know for sure. Again, it could have continued to corrupt that good bloodline. Yeah, John.
Yeah, I think you're right. Hopefully we don't know about people on the earth at that time, sure, but there would have been children, offspring of these people who died, who were not of an age that they could have made a choice.
Right.
And I suppose we don't know if Noah's communication reached every corner of the earth. We can assume so, or maybe we can argue not, but I think the bottom line is, just like in every age, including our own, God's going to be just.
Right.
How he deals with those situations.
I definitely wouldn't want to question God's justness or fairness when it comes to that, right? Right. But it is something that I think we commonly think that, hey, all the good people were on the ark. And I don't know that that's true or untrue. Yes, ma'am.
So do you think verse 12, when it talks about God seeing that it's corrupt, it says, for all flesh is corrupted their own way, are you thinking that's a hyperbole that he's using? Or I wasn't sure, because it seems to be explicit that in what God has revealed. So, but I know the Bible sometimes talks in extremes, so I wasn't sure if that's how you were.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's just one of those points that I think it's very common to think one path, and I don't know that it's explicitly stated. So I don't want to go down a rabbit hole that maybe I'm not prepared for, but I just think it's one of those things that is open. It's not. Certainly, the earth was in a bad place. Society was in a bad place, and God felt at this point it's time to start over. That disappointment, that hurt. Yes, sir.
Even today, there are good people that are not going to make it to heaven because they don't obey God. And just back then, in the time of Noah and Ark, there were probably good people, but they were not obedient to God. They did not walk with God.
Right. And a matter of fact, I would say, and this point's later, but I'll bring it up now. We don't know anything about Noah's family, except Noah had 3 sons. Noah had a wife, and the 3 sons had a wife. But nothing is said about their spiritual character, or that they were particularly faithful one way or the other. But that's what God chose for Noah to bring with him to the ark. So, again, I'm not saying that they were or were not faithful, but it's not stated, right? So, let's take a look at the ark for a few minutes itself. A couple things to note about the ark. God specifies the measurements in verses 15 and 16, but here's a look at the size of the ark in comparison to some things that we might recognize from today. I know there's a full-scale replica in Kentucky. Has anybody been there? What were your impressions of it when you saw it? Yeah?
There's one of the things that interests you there in it, other things that you learn that you don't think about.
Okay.
And then there's things too that's really stuff.
Yeah. Renee, you said, what's your impression from having been there?
Are overwhelmed by how big
Yeah.
stuff like that, but you could see how it was adequate to do
For the task. Yeah. I mean, there's some stats here, and I don't know if it's easy to read or not, but I mean, it's about over 1.4 million cubic feet and could hold 125,000 sheep-sized animals, right? Some would be bigger, some would be smaller, but that's a lot, right? And I think in the handout, Josh mentioned that similar-sized vessels were not constructed until the late 1880s. So this had no precedent before this ark was designed and built. And well, any idea how long it took to build the ark? I hear somebody saying something. I think it's at least 100 years. When we're introduced to Noah, he's 500 years old. DK will cover the flood on Sunday, but Noah's 600 years old at the time of the flood. So this took a while, right? Electric saws may not have sped that process up a whole lot. Here's a rendering of how the ark may have been organized on its decks. And as you look at this, again, I don't know how well you can see it, but I always thought of the ark as some sort of boat. But there's really no mention of any sort of rudder or any steering. And so the ark really functions as more of a chest or a vessel than it does as a boat. And this chest, if you will, was used for shelter and the orderly existence of the living creatures inside. Right? And when you think of the ark as a chest, I think there's a natural comparison to the Ark of the Covenant, even though this word for the ark is a different Hebrew word than the Ark of the Covenant. But this word, I think it's teba in Hebrew, for this type of ark, it is used one other time in Scripture. Does anybody know where? What's that? Yeah, the basket for Moses is the same Hebrew word as this ark here. Obviously different size and scope, but it serves the same purpose, right? When you think about this providing shelter through water and ultimately life, salvation for its inhabitants, it's a pretty interesting parallel there. But that was something that I learned that did not know before. Thought maybe you might find that interesting as well. And I don't know about you, but I also don't really recall making the connection when I first heard these stories as a youngster between the passage of Noah and his family, nor Moses, through this water to new life, to baptism. 1 Peter 3 and verses 18 through 22 says exactly this, but I'm not sure that we make that connection real easily when we first hear these stories, even though, as you may think about it when you're older, it's really actually a very obvious connection. 1 Peter 3, 18 through 22, I'll read it, says, "For Christ also died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which also he went and made proclamation to the spirits now in prison, who were once disobedient, when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who's at the right hand of God, having gone into heaven after angels and authorities and powers have been subjected to him." So, again, I don't know that I made that connection. Maybe you did. You guys are much smarter than I am, but that was new to me. Yes, ma'am.
To kind of continue off of that, I think that that theme of water and salvation is really cool, and it also, it's not only just salvation through water, but also death through water, because in all the stories, like, the wicked dies, and if you think of, like, the parting of the Red Sea, they go through water and are saved, but then the Egyptians die through it, and when we are baptized ourselves, our old self is washed away, dies, and then the new man is saved.
Yeah, evil is consumed in the water, right? And it is taken care of in the water. Absolutely. Other thoughts or comments? And hopefully you can see, again, how much groundwork is laid in Genesis for the rest of the Bible and for the concepts that we understand today and how the people in the New Testament would have come to understand as God teaches them, or Jesus gave them instructions on how to live and what to do, right? I think so much of that groundwork was in this heritage and in stories that they probably knew, stories like we most likely have known our whole lives. So God makes a covenant with Noah. He reveals the details of this destruction in verse 17. Behold, even I am bringing the flood of water upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life from under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall perish. And continuing in verse 18, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And we know that he was to bring 2 of every living thing as well. This is the first time in Scripture we see the word covenant. What is a covenant? An agreement? An agreement between 2 parties. Those parties do not have to be equal parties, but each party binds themselves to their responsibilities in that agreement to uphold that covenant. What was God's part of the covenant? And I think there's 2 parts. He was going to save Noah and his family. Yep, I think that's part 1. That's okay. It must just be me. It's okay. Yeah, my turn. I think they were going to save Noah from the flood waters, right? But I think they were also saving Noah and his family from the wickedness that was going on and the evil that had surrounded them, right? So I think maybe not explicitly stated, but there were 2 parts to how God was going to take care of Noah. It was just deliverance from the physical of the flood, but also from maybe the lack of proper spiritual environment that Noah and his family were in. And Noah's part? Yeah, do what he was commanded, right? So Noah was to do exactly what the Lord instructed regarding building the ark and in bringing all the living things to the ark. And what was Noah's response to what the Lord told him to do? What's that? No. He didn't say, I'm 500 years old, I can't do it. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Verse 22, thus Noah did according to all that God had commanded him, so he did. I did it. He did it, right? There was no question. There was no pushback. There was no hesitation there. And he did. And again, we talked about it. This was potentially a 100-year-long endeavor, right? And I think maybe DK will probably talk about maybe what else was going on at the time on Sunday. But 100 years. Again, I don't know that we can think of life in the same terms as you had people that were living to be 700, 800, 900 years old. But that's a significant stretch. I mean, that's at least, you try to draw a comparison. If you live to be 90, that's a decade, if the comparison is to 9. So for 100 years, Noah did all that God had commanded him. And Noah becomes one of the great examples of faith talked about throughout the Bible. Hebrews 11, chapter 11, verses 6 and 7. And without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. By faith Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen, in reverence prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world, and became an heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. In that 100-year period, Noah didn't have any evidence that a flood was coming. The storm clouds didn't roll in and just sit around for 90-some-odd years. But he trusted in God and followed his instruction. Noah's story also sets up another key part of the gospel. And if you've already read the handout or maybe you've come to this conclusion, what do you think that might be? Another key component of the gospel that Noah introduces here. Or God through Noah introduces to us. Yep, we have to follow the instructions given to us. And in doing so, that obedience and righteousness of one can save many, right? We know that Noah was married, had 3 married sons. Again, we know nothing of their own faith or character, but Noah was remarkable. Right? Noah walked with God He was the one that God chose to make his covenant with, and through his obedience to God's instructions, he and his family would be saved. 2 Peter 2 and verse 5, speaking of God, that he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. And most significantly, we know this in the righteousness of Jesus, right? So as we flash forward to Jesus, as mentioned in Romans chapter 5, verses 18 through 19, so then, as through one transgression there resulted in condemnation to all men, even so through one act of righteousness there resulted justification of life to all men. For as though the one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, even so through the obedience of the one the many will be made righteous. And so I think Noah introduces this concept that one righteous person can save others. And of course, as we know, Jesus would do just that. Right? Comments? Thoughts on that?
There's something powerful about this. You pointed out Hebrews that the faith Noah did, which is very powerful.
Absolutely.
It says in Genesis 6, verse 8, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And then he did. Those two components equal his salvation. It was his faith, it was God's grace, but at the end of the day, to receive his faith or to be saved, you have to.
Yeah. And I think it would be very easy to, once again, Noah or the other people had to do their part, right? But none of this stuff would have been possible without God, right? God created the environment such that you couldn't look at the things that happen or the things that we talk about and not see that only God could do those things. Other thoughts or comments? While we're right at the bell, I appreciate the time and the consideration and your comments. I'll get a little bit better at it on the next class. You'll have DK on Sunday covering chapters 7 and 8. Thank you.